And welcome everybody to another Wildling webinar and conversation. We're really excited about today. It's in a way kind of our swan song to our Starry Nights exhibition that hardly anyone saw thanks to COVID. Both of our friends here, Nathan, participated in that show, and we're a key part of having it be so wonderful. And so we're very excited that they're here today to share their knowledge and their background as artists and collectors and art historians. I'll mention a couple things that are coming up. We do have a talk coming up that Lauren's going to put the info in the chat box later, but Nicole Strasberg and Holly Harmon, who currently have our window installations here at the Wildling that maybe you might have seen some press on, they're going to be doing another conversation to talk about what they went through to create the amazing things they volunteered to give us. We feel so lucky to have those things here. And if you haven't seen them yet, do a drive-by, do a walk-by to see Nicole and Holly's windows. They're really extraordinary. And then we're also going to do a coffee with the director on, I think it's March 2nd or 3rd. Lauren can pop that date in there as well. And just kind of have a conversation, open-ended, ask your questions of me about what's coming up with the museum. So I'm looking forward to that. And then, of course, we'll be getting more programs set up very soon and letting you all know that. So with that, I want to introduce formally Nathan Vonk, who has the Leon Dabo Nocturne painting behind him. Nathan is the owner of the wonderful Sullivan and Goss Gallery. And I'm so pleased that over the years, we just have a great relationship with Sullivan and Goss. They've been so generous in lending artworks, historic artworks, to different shows of ours over the years. I don't know what I would do if they weren't there and so willing to help us out and share their wonderful art with our community. So I'm very grateful to Nathan. And then our other Nathan is one of the artists in the show who has that amazing giant dramatic piece in the back that he's going to be talking about and other works. And he does teach art at Westmont and is just an amazing artist I think he's had shows at Sullivan Goss and other places as well. So we have friends here. I feel like we're just talking among friends, and I think that's what it's going to be, is a really fun conversation. And when they're kind of done with their more formal presentations, we're excited to kind of really open it up. And Lauren's going to keep an eye on the chat room for questions, so you can always feel free to type in there. But I think during the more formal PowerPoint presentations that both Nathans will be doing for us, maybe keep yourselves muted, and then we'll open it up after that. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to turn it over. I think Nathan Vonk is going to go first. Is that correct?
Sure.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Take it away.
All right. Bear with me, guys, while I share my screen here real quick. All right. So I'm going to go more or less chronologically here through a sort of basic history of the tradition of the Western tradition of nocturnal landscape painting. And within that chronology, the thing to remember when we start out is that this painting, for instance, let's say this is painted in the 1530s, would have been something that was, one, very hard to produce, and two, very hard to really look at and display because of how dark it is. And so when you go back in the history of nocturnes, one of the important questions is, why would you paint a painting like this? Because of course, there's no electric lights, there aren't LED, track lighting things. So paintings like this were very, very difficult to both produce and display. And so the motivation for creating them changes throughout the years, but goes through three main themes. And with this one, what we see here is one of the first themes is illustration, often of biblical or mythological narratives, because back in the day you would have had an audience that was mostly illiterate. And so like in this one, this is illustrating St. Matthew and the angel. But what's important about this one in the history of nocturnes is two things. One, that you have three different sort of scenes within a single painting. So you have the central figure there being inspired by the angel, but on either side you have scenes from St. Matthew's life. And it's almost like an early version of a graphic novel in some regards. And then on the left side, you see that there's a little scene there with three figures, if you can see it, and a moon above it. And so that's sort of the beginnings of a nocturnal landscape. It's very, very early. And this breaking up of the scene into multiple parts with multiple lighting sources is something that has a huge influence on the evolution of night painting, as we'll see here in a minute. So then my next slide here, Adam Alzheimer. This is one of the early great nocturnes that influences a whole generation, generations and generations of nocturne paintings thereafter. This is a very small painting. In reality, it's about it's 12 by 16. But what makes this particular one of the many things that makes this particular one so interesting and important, it's one of the very first ones that has diminished the size of the central figures here of Joseph and Mary, and emphasized the landscape for one of the first times. The flight into Egypt is a subject that is important because one of the only reasons you would make a painting this dark back then is when you were illustrating a scene that took place at night. And so the flight into Egypt is one of those scenes that gets painted over and over and over, as you'll see it in a few more slides. But what's important about this one, and harkens back to the slide we just saw, is that you have multiple sources of light. Here you really have four. You have the moon and its reflection being 1 and 2. You have Mary, Joseph, and Jesus in the center, and then you have the campfire on the right. And each of those different light sources has a different kind of light. It throws a different color of light and it's a different kind of challenge when you're trying to depict those sources of light. And this is all within a very, very small painting. I'd also mention here that this painting is really amazing because it's one of the first depictions of the Milky Way that you can see. And I mentioned that in part because one of my favorite parts of the show at the Wildling was some of the astrophotography that they had there, where you could see those photographically. But the stars, there's even actually realistic constellations in this painting. The artist didn't live very long, and he wouldn't have actually known how important this painting would become. This painting was eventually made into an etching that was spread throughout Europe and influenced some more familiar names, such as Rubens that we have here. Now, unlike the last one, Rubens has done a sort of more traditional thing where he has put the subject much more front and center. The landscape is not nearly as important, but he does borrow Alzheimer's moon and reflection of the moon on the water there. And in part, at this point, one of the things that happens is I think artists want to show off exactly how good they are and how well they can depict these multiple sources of light. So taking on the subject of the flight into Egypt, for instance, is kind of a challenge. And not very many artists, even Rubens, didn't do very many nocturnes in his life, but this was one that they would do. And so here you have the influence of Alzheimer, but at the same time you have the central source of light, and this one is baby Jesus. The next one here you have, again, another very familiar name in Rembrandt, and he again has taken the subjects and made them much smaller again, emphasizing the landscape. So in some regards, the subject here is an excuse to focus on the landscape in a way that was distinct from the one by Rubens. Here again, you can even see that in the title. It's a landscape with the rest of the flight into Egypt, as opposed to just the flight into Egypt. And you don't have the reflection of the moon on the water, but you do have the reflection of the campfire in the water, which becomes a theme. You've got the yellow light, usually on the right-hand side, and the sort of whitish blue light, usually on the right-hand side. Not so much here, but in many of the ones we'll see. And here in the next slide, I'm going to go out of chronological order, but I couldn't help myself because this Lockwood Deforest is so reminiscent of the house on the hill in the Rembrandt painting that I just couldn't help but notice that look how amazing, how similar those are, how far apart they are. But there's a clear echo there. Who knows if Lockwood Deforest had ever seen this Rembrandt painting, but the similarities are sort of obvious. So I wanted to throw that in. The next reason why people were painting and viewing nocturne paintings was, again, this is part of the sort of illustration and documentation of natural phenomena. So now you've moved away from biblical scenes, but you are documenting a scene that is best seen at night. And so in the 1770s, Vesuvius erupts, and if you were a wealthy patron of the arts and you did the grand tour and you saw this in person, you would want to bring a painting or a representation of what you saw back home so you could show off to your friends the incredible thing you had just seen, this natural wonder. But if you look at these 5 examples, it's, again, almost always you've got the orange light on the right and the white light on the left. This scene was in fact so popular that if you look at the bottom 2, those are they're not quite the same painting, but they're very similar. So one would assume that this sort of depiction was so in demand that the artist just sort of made a copy of one of his own paintings. And this is just an example. He made dozens and dozens of these from various different views throughout the years. Here again, I bring Lockwood Deforest sort of out of the chronology because as part of the motivation for creating nocturne paintings is documentation, as it was with the Vesuvius. Deforest is interesting in that way because he's very rare insofar as he dates so many of his paintings to the day. So he's also making documentations of what he's seeing, but it's not so much for anyone else but himself. So if you look, if you can kind of see in the bottom right corner there, it says October 26, 1874. And we've always thought of these as kind of like visual diaries. He was not somebody who was interested in necessarily showing these off to anybody else, but the fact that he dated them to the day is quite unique. Another example here, and still with Lockwood Deforest, you have to wonder, he was painting these outdoors in the dark, and that's not a simple thing to do before electricity. And he did it many, many times in many, many different ways, frequently putting in dates, to just sort of document what he was seeing. And you can go back today and you can look at the dates on his paintings and see that he was always recording the accurate sort of phase of the moon. You can see if it was October 26, 1874, the moon was full that day. He never made it up. He didn't invent anything. He was recording what he was looking at. Now, the next evolution and the motivation of the creation of nocturnes is getting into sort of a more evocative motivation where you're not really, it's not quite so important what the landscape is, but more about creating a feeling in the thing you're depicting. This might be one of my favorite nocturnes ever painted, and it's by certainly by one of my favorite painters ever. Moonlight, a Study at Millbank. And again, the title here sort of suggests that moonlight is the most important part, not so much that it happens in Millbank. And so the focus here is on the moon, on the light, and about the sort of atmosphere that these create. And Turner was sort of specialist in that, and he didn't make all that many nocturnes. He made a few, and he recorded, again, kind of like in Vesuvius, he recorded some, the explosion of Parliament and things like that happened at night. But this one is just so serene and so much about the sort of feeling that the atmosphere creates in the painting. It's really the best example of that sort of evocative nature of nocturnes. Taking that a step farther, you have Caspar David Friedrich, who goes so far into evocation to become very romantic. And so he painted this 3 different times. This is one of his most famous paintings. There's 2 men on either side and a man and a woman in the center. And they're just contemplating the moon, right? So it's very much now moving away from this, what's being depicted specifically in the landscape, but more about inviting you to contemplate and think about things and feel things based on what is in the depiction. And that becomes a really, really important thing moving forward, as we'll get to. And moving towards this, for instance, many years later, this is a Leon Dabo. This is the one that was at the Wildling. Same artist who painted the piece behind me here. And here again, you know, this is not about the scene itself so much as the feeling that the scene evokes in the viewer. The trees, the boats, the very, very dark foreground are really just there as a total part of the composition that is meant to make you sort of feel something specific. It's not about the specifics of the subjects that are there. Dabo is one of this kind of painting is called tonalism. Dabo is one of the great masters of that. Wrong way, sorry. And then that translates, as we move forward, to a couple pieces that were in the Wildling show. This piece by Ferdinand Lundgren is in part also about romance, and it's about the romance of the West. At the time when this was painted, there was a great sort of feeling of romance towards this, the Wild West and the California missions and the early Spanish colonial time of California. And so this and this would both be part of that school of, you know, this is a really lovely painting. You've got, again, a reflection on water, as you would before. You don't see the moon, but you see the light of the moon. And that sort of light, Peters was painting paintings like this, sort of like Valera was painting the paintings of Vesuvius, you know, various different sort of variations of a theme. But these are sort of, you know, these cozy cabins in these tiny little villas out in the West, with stars and a warm light inside. A very romantic scene. It would have been seen very romantically at the time it was done. This would be then a contemporary version kind of that. So this was also in the Wildling show. This is Chris Peters. He's a very interesting artist because he used to paint still life paintings, and he came to Sullivan Goss and saw an exhibition of paintings we had done by Lockwood Deforest, of moonlight paintings. And he was so inspired that he decided he was no longer going to paint still life paintings. He was going to teach himself to paint tonalist landscapes of the moon. And he did. It took him 2 years. But again, this is part of the Dabo. Dabo was part of this tradition of creating paintings that were about feelings, not about the specifics of what's depicted therein. And so these are very difficult paintings to paint because you have to have a sense of space and shape and light, but you don't want to necessarily have specifics, because one of the goals of these paintings is to allow the viewer to bring as much as possible to the painting and not sort of force them to, like, here's this and here's that. This is about creating a suggestion of space and place so that the viewer can have the experience that they bring to it. So this is a contemporary example of that sort of branch of the tree of Nocturne about evocation and romance in some ways. The last sort of branch of this tree and the last evolution that Nocturnes are so important is in the move towards abstraction. So we begin with, you know, description and illustration. You go on to evocation, and here too, evocation is important, but formally you're moving farther away from depicting anything in particular, and more about what the feelings are that the paintings produce. So the word nocturne, you might know, actually comes from music, from Chopin's nocturnes, and Whistler borrows a whole bunch of different kinds of terms from music to apply to his paintings, compositions, nocturnes, things like that, to emphasize the sort of evocation that music has as a non-narrative instrumental type of art onto his painting. So he's very specifically trying to do that. This one I chose specifically because it was such an influence on what Leon Dabo ended up doing. Whistler was a generation older, an American, but moved to London and never came back to the United States. And when Leon Dabo did his grand tour, he was very clearly influenced by James Neal Whistler. Whether or not he actually met Whistler is sort of an old fisherman's tale that we don't know the facts behind, but it was clearly influenced by him. This one is a sort of more specific example of the subject leaving the painting entirely. This one is called Nocturne Black and Gold, but Whistler actually got in trouble during his lifetime because the critic Ruskin had accused him of just throwing paint on a canvas and putting it out in front of people. But this painting is very specifically, the beginnings of abstract art, and more about the sort of forms and colors and shapes that can create evocative experiences without having to depict the specifics in the scene. And so for my final slide, I use this in part, this Kandinsky painting, in part because this isn't specifically a nocturne, but it is a composition in the same way that Whistler's was a composition. So when Kandinsky was moving away from doing objective art and into completely non-objective abstraction, he too, like Whistler, was using the sort of motif of music in his titling, and he did improvisations and movements and all of these various different things to emphasize that the goal of these paintings was about creating a feeling in the viewer, not about creating a sort of specific depiction of anything outside the frame of the painting itself. I think that ends my presentation.
Nathan, before you stop sharing, I have a kind of question for you. I love this framing of the three different movements, that are happening in this historical precedence. I'm curious, in the description and illustration phase, where you were talking about the warm of the light that's either emanating from like the Christ child and then the cool of the night light of the moon, whether those had any kind of narrative significance at the time, or whether those are just observations that we're seeing now.
That's hard to say exactly. I mean, in this one, I put up the Rubens one because this one does have some narrative significance. I mean, you can see on the right-hand side that Joseph is looking back to see, it's very sort of hard to see in the picture, but right above the reflection of the moon, you see there's somebody there on horseback. So clearly, like, they're in active flight away from somebody that might be chasing them. But I think the short answer is, it's very hard for me to say because in some cases, it's not seeming like, in this Alzheimer piece, I wouldn't say that the moon, particularly section of the painting, is necessary in any way towards the narrative of what's going on. It was clearly just something he wanted to do, and so I think that's why I think this is such an important piece, because you really can't argue that he was doing anything other than showing off, and really wanted to emphasize how different kinds of light in different scenarios can be depicted, and wanted to do it, and he did it all in one very small little canvas.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions while I've got slides up?
I did see Kevin asked in the chat, is the Savoldo dark, or has it darkened over time? And I'm curious if some of these are lighter or darker than when they were originally painted.
I can't give an honest answer to that. One, I've never seen this painting in person. And two, I just don't know the history of this particular painting well enough to say one way or the other. I'd say, just from my knowledge of old paintings generally, I'd say there's a very good chance it's darkened some, quite substantially. And nobody's quite really sure what's going on over on the left-hand side of that painting. On the right-hand side is when St. Matthew goes and receives hospitality from the Queen of Ethiopia. The other one is just sort of too obscure and too small to be absolutely certain what's going on. Alrighty.
I'd love to circle back around to, Nathan, at some point, to a conversation you and I have had about how these were made.
Yeah.
and the kind of like strategies that artists use to paint in the dark and to depict dark painting. So I don't know if you want to take a initial stab at that and maybe other
Well,
questions.
sure, yeah. So remember that, particularly like the one that's closest to me is Lockwood Deforest, because Lockwood Deforest was painting most of his nocturne paintings outdoors in the dark before electricity, and that's difficult. It's not only difficult to do. So if you are painting by a candlelight or a gas lamp of some kind, that throws a very orange light onto what you're doing. And so you've got to sort of compensate for that in real time as you're painting. And another possibility that's been suggested, not by an artist, I don't paint myself, of course, so I have to rely upon the expertise of others. But it's been suggested that some artists would paint by the full moon and use a mirror to frame up what they wanted to paint with the moonlight behind them, so that the moonlight was lighting the canvas and was in the sort of framed shot that they had created for themselves via a mirror. But again, moonlight throws a very sort of bluish light onto what you're doing. So you're still going to have to compensate. So whatever you do, you then have to bring it out in the daylight and have some confidence about knowing what it's going to look like. And then beyond that, it's almost impossible to display them. So when Lockwood Deforest was painting these very, very dark paintings, there wouldn't have been a very easy way to see them. The houses wouldn't have had the light to show them. You would have had to really bring them out into the daylight. And so in Lockwood Deforest's case, we've always just said that's a sort of key data point in sort of our hypothesis, that he just did them out of a pure passion of his own personal passion. He wasn't doing it for anybody else. He didn't care what anybody else thought. He just loved painting the moon outdoors in the dark. And if nobody else could really see what he was doing, it didn't matter. It wasn't important to him.
So curious. Well, thank you. Maybe I'll share a few slides, and folks, if you want to add more questions in the chat, keep the comments that Nathan had and the images in your mind. I'll confess that I feel, let me get myself sharing real fast. I feel somewhat a little bit embarrassed sharing work in a trajectory of such heavy hitters as we're just given by Nathan. So I'm thinking about my work in some of the context that you described it. And as I think about the work that I'm most interested in making, it generally connects to the evocative nature of the descriptions that you were, of trying to capture an emotion, of trying to offer an experience for viewers to engage with. And for much of my work, I've got a couple of slides that I'm going to show you, a few of some past ones, and then some work that ties into Nocturnes. But for much of my work, I'm interested in trying to suspend a moment, to hold something aloft and look at it from different angles. And so this piece is entitled "This Drawing Glows," and it is 4 large sheets of paper with a bunch of kind of Trump oil sheets of typing paper that are being depicted flying around. And then there's a fan in the foreground that's actually blowing at the paper. And it's that space between the depicted sense of something and the real experiential space that to me is the most fruitful and most engaging in art. And for me, as I've kind of come to think about the night sky and its relationship in my own practice, has been very much that experiential wanting to know about it and the inability to comprehend it. So I come at this conversation not as like a scientist or an astronomer, but just someone that has felt that powerful sense in my body and how that then translates into the emotions. And so I think about the kind of daytime scenes, things that we look at as having the narrative drama, the backdrop of our lives is the sky, right? So we see these clouds, we see these yellow lights, we see the atmosphere on some level that we go about our daily life in. But at night, for me, what happens is that the cosmos opens up so much deeper in its spatial flux, the relationship to my body. So I don't feel as near to the atmosphere during the night as I do during the day. And that opening out has been kind of increasingly interesting to me, as much of my work has used kind of white blank spaces in the past. In the last couple of years, I've started to explore that expanded field of light emanating from the distance. And so these are a couple of paintings that I hope to try and play with that, of using something front and center in the foreground that you can see the three-dimensionality of it, and then offer an ambiguous space back behind that. At times, that space that goes back behind the objects, for me, I use the night sky to depict a void or an opening. And that can be perhaps a visual opening using color and light, but it can also be a psychological opening. And I don't know about you all, but the night is full of all kinds of dynamics, including insomnia, including wanting to rest, including, you know, whether one has nightmares or delightful evenings. There's such a complex range in there. And so for me, explicitly, sometimes I use the night to talk about sleep. But I also have encountered, I'll read this in a minute, this crazy, at least for me, it felt like a crazy experience of sitting out on my back porch over the past couple of years and watching stargazing and getting one of those little apps on your iPhone. I don't know if any of you have these where you can like track the constellations. And so I'd be watching the constellations from the summer into the winter. And as the constellations shift and they drop behind the hillside, it felt so different than when the sun goes down and the clouds go down. Rather, I could sense that there was this physical presence of the stars on the other side of the mountain and then transitioning that underneath me. And so that dropping below the horizon to me became a really fascinating thing. This is a poem by Sylvia Plath that I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs of 5 because I think it's a wonderful illustration of this. Stars over the door, Joan. Stars are dropping thick as stones into the twiggy picket of trees whose silhouette is darker than the dark of the sky because it is quite starless. The woods are a well, and the stars drop silently. They seem large, yet they drop and no gap is visible. Nor do they send up fires where they fall or any signal of distress or anxiousness. They are eaten immediately by the pines. Where I am at home, only the sparsest stars arrive at twilight, and then after some effort, they are wan, dulled by much traveling. The smaller and more timid never arrive at all, but stay sitting far out in their own dust. They are orphans. I cannot see them, they are lost. But tonight, they have discovered this river with no trouble. They're scrubbed and self-assured as the great planets. It goes on for 3 more stanzas, which are really lovely. That sense of things dropping beyond my visibility has been a theme that I've been interested in for some time. This is a painting that I'm still working on right now. It's titled All the Light We Cannot See, which is after a really wonderful novel. But I am interested in that space of how long it takes the light to reach us. And we know that the closest light, aside from our star, the closest aside from our own sun, takes us about 4 years in light years for the light from that star to reach us. And some of the more distant ones, up to 7,000 years for light that we can see from the Hubble telescope. And so that kind of collapsing down of the experience of light and time has been generating a lot of work for me. So this piece is exploring some of that, including some of the possible lenses and narratives over time. You might notice in that past image there was a kind of parabola arc of the stars. I'm often using forms that repeat themselves in my work because I think that they offer familiar territory, and when one sees them multiple times, they begin to give clues for how to interpret the works. And so these pieces are from a series entitled Skies and Schisms, starting back in 2017 and moving to the current. They often feature motifs of oaks and boats, and in this case, sycamore leaves. But I began to use that parabola shape as an opening to another time space. And that's kind of how I was thinking about them conceptually as I was making them. And it gives a visual portal out of the painting as well. And at times those portals, you know, can be gently soft, can be gentle and softly falling like these eucalyptus leaves or more potent and visceral like a larger boulder. But I'm curious about how we envision time and how we envision the spaces that we inhabit. That kind of transience and movement is a fascinating space for me as well as the days pass. I mean, we're coming up on almost a year of being quarantined in COVID, and it feels like both forever and no time at all. And for some reason, the night, not for some reason, I suspect the night goes so fast because we sleep through most of it. But that kind of open dreamscape continues to energize my work. This is one of the 3 works that was in the Wildling show. And you can see from the previous body of work kind of a repeated motif of this boat inhabiting different spaces. And this one, the boat is more anchored through the center of the tree. The fluidity is happening in the sheets that are blowing on the trees, or perhaps the stars and the portal behind. And that wonderfully odd sense of recognizing that if I lay down on the ground and I'm looking up at the stars at night, those same stars are actually beneath me as well. And I don't know why, but the night sky lets me think about that more deeply than when I'm experiencing the day sky. Lauren Sharp created this video for the exhibition, and I just thought it was a really lovely one. So I'm going to play this briefly for you. It has some images of the works installed, some kind of awkward ones of me installing it, but a great sense of scale. So I'm going to play this for us briefly. Oops. Thank you, Lauren, for that. Doesn't the Wildling staff just do an amazing job promoting their events? I think that you all do really incredible things, and I was honored to be the recipient of that video. As mentioned in some of the text in that video, this larger scale piece for me is about that sense of space, of time, of memories that are present. And for those of us that live in Southern California, wildfire clearing and brush clearing feels very prevalent. And as each time that I'm training up bushes or trimming off low limbs of oak trees, I'm often thinking about these seasons and how long it took these limbs to grow. And so this piece is an exploration of that. I'll end with this image here, which also features the night sky and features various forms of illumination. I enjoyed seeing those representations, Nathan, that you were sharing, and that's something else that I am intrigued by is color temperature, is connection to narrative, and how experiences in our life might bring illumination to us, both in the day and at night. So thanks for letting me share a little bit about the works in this show and some of my larger practice. Out of my sharing here.
Thank you guys so much. That was so good, so informative. I can't imagine there aren't all kinds of pent-up questions out there. So if you guys want to unmute or type them in the chat room, now's the time.
I did want to say, I mean, it's been a pleasure working with both of you so much, and our Starry Nights show would not have been what it was without both of your incredible loans. Nathan Huff, I was curious, along with the parabola, there's so many interesting symbols that you see throughout, and I wondered if you have any kind of personal symbol language that perhaps the rowboat or ladders and linens represent while you're working, if it's a secret language?
No, it's not necessarily a secret language, but I'm not often totally conscious of it myself. I mean, there are repeated motifs. I use the rowboat as a stand-in for the figure often, usually an individual's kind of journey in a way of kind of isolating down to a single person rather than a communal system. So that's one that I use. Oftentimes I think about when I start using something in my practice, like an image, it turns into a snowball and it keeps kind of grabbing other things and carrying it with it. So something that might be a holdover from another piece will extend into it. So the ladder, similarly to the boat is a transient space floating between air and water, which are two types of the same material. And the ladder can do a similar thing through height. And so I like both of those as metaphors.
So I have a question for Nathan Vonk. I happen to know you guys do have quite a collection of Lockwood Deforest. So I don't know if you might share a little bit more about that collection. We've been graced with being able to borrow several over the years, and we really appreciate that.
Sure, it's an interesting thing because the way many of you may have heard that very recently Lockwood Deforest's grandson, Kellum Deforest, passed away, which is a huge loss. But what isn't really, nothing I've read in any of his sort of obituaries or write-ups is that if it weren't for him, if it weren't for Kellum, Lockwood Deforest would be largely forgotten in time. And it was about 20, 25 years ago that Kellum walked into this gallery and talked to Frank Goss and said, "Frank, would you be interested in showing some of my granddad's paintings?" And there were a couple of Nocturnes, and Frank said, "Yeah, these are beautiful. Sure, I'll put them up on the wall. I don't know who this guy is, but these are really nice." So he puts them on the wall, and they sell very quickly. And so, of course, that gets Frank excited because he's an art dealer. And so he calls Kellum and gets a few more. And over the next 10 years or so, we sort of worked with Kellum and showed some paintings here and there. And we're sort of working with the understanding that Kellum had the entire sort of collection of Lockwood Deforest paintings. But then in 2011, one of Kellum's cousins passed away and didn't have any children of their own and passed on over 400 paintings to their best friend. And so the best friend looked at it and was like, "Well, what are these? What have I got?" And got online and called us, said, "So guys, what have I got?" And so I flew out there and documented this collection of paintings. And amongst them, there were Egyptian paintings and Santa Barbara paintings and Monterey paintings and lots of nocturnes. And so it was the first time when we had come to the realization that, in fact, what we had thought was the entirety of Lockwood Deforest's work was just a small fraction. And so we sort of put together a family tree and did the reverse math to sort of guess about how many paintings he might have done in his lifetime. I would guess it's in the 2,000 or 3,000 number. I've seen more than almost anyone else alive, other than my colleagues here. and I've still only seen a fraction of them. But the fact that he painted, as many as maybe 400 or 500 nighttime paintings during his lifetime is really, really interesting. The other thing that we hypothesize about him, we always wondered why Lockwood Deforest moved from New York City, where he was a sort of very well-known artist in around 1900, to Santa Barbara, which was the middle of nowhere back then. And he would come here in the wintertime, which is sort of high gallery season in New York, and so that's sort of a bad career move. But we learned through some interviews that when Lockwood first moved here, he was losing his hearing relatively badly. And we met a guy who was ancient when we met him 10 years ago, who was like the last surviving person who had met Lockwood Deforest when he was a kid. And he said Lockwood Deforest was nearly deaf and had one of those cones that he'd stick in his ear. And so we hypothesized that possibly one of the reasons Lockwood Deforest painted so many of those is because he was going deaf badly, and would go out in the dark and paint these paintings of the moon in the silence of the nighttime and not have to worry about the fact that he couldn't hear what was going on around him. And in that way, there's these sort of almost like beautiful self-portraits. That's like him out there by himself in the silence of the night. And it makes them just a little bit more sort of poetic and interesting in that way, because he didn't make a lot of stuff up, but the idea of this man sitting outside in the dark painting these paintings is really a lovely one.
We did receive a question. Tom asked, do we know if Lockwood Deforest had specific interest in astronomy, or were his nocturnes drawn strictly from an artistic landscape interest?
I don't know of any interest he had in astronomy. I know he had a camera and was interested in optics in some ways, but whether or not he didn't paint anything other than the moon. I don't know that he ever painted stars, and he never painted the sun that I know of. Even the very bright moonlight paintings that he painted, I'm absolutely certain are the moon setting on a bright moon set. I don't think he ever painted the sun. So I don't know. I don't believe so. I think it was just strictly from an artistic landscape point of view.
Fascinating.
I was going to say, shifting back to Nathan Huff, Meg asked Nathan if you could talk a little more about your last painting that you showed, Lumens.
Sure, Meg. I made a sculpture prior to making that image, which is a boat that's it's showed at Sullivan Goss. It's a boat suspended by a welded anchor, and the anchor is made up of a chandelier that you can plug in and light up. And so there's this kind of floating boat, and then this illumination from underneath. And one of the things that I'm most interested in is shifting between painting and sculpture and back to painting, and seeing how the experience of the art changes. And so that painting was a reinterpretation of that sculpture, but amplifying up the illumination from underneath. So that was the attempt at that one.
I've got a question for you, Nathan. So one of the things that sort of I didn't talk about much, but that ties you to the sort of history that I put together is the word you never mentioned, but you sort of alluded to is a sort of sense of the sublime in some way, or the sort of sense of like being just out of your ability to conceive of it and grasp it. And what I find interesting about your practice generally is that I find absolutely fascinating is your paintings capture this sort of very distinct sense of subconscious something. But what I don't understand is that how do you create that? Because as not a painter myself, and you have these enormous canvases, or enormous pieces of paper anyway sometimes, how much of it is improvisation and how much of it is you make a conception and then go for it? Because it's hard for me to reconcile the effectiveness of this sort of subconscious vision that you create and the idea that you do that in a planned out way. You know, it's sort of, that doesn't seem to balance for me. So I find it fascinating, your sort of creative process, how you do that.
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. The sublime is certainly present in most of the things that I'm interested in. It's usually the just beyond the incomprehensible and the kind of terrifying that engages me. And if I can eliminate a lot of those bridges that tie them together to me, then I get quickly at that sense of almost but not yet. In regards to the kind of practice and the improvisational nature of it, it is very much that. It's how do I take a kind of set of images or symbols and recirculate them in a number of ways. And then, as you also know, I make quite a bit of work, and so I'll often make several iterations of the same thing. And then I'll just choose one to share that has the right balance of those things. And sometimes that happens in a sculptural form, or sometimes that happens in a painted form. But the other quick answer to that is I used to make really, really layered, dense oil paintings with lots and lots of things on top of each other. There were abstract elements and visual elements, and they were all kind of colliding in there. And they were getting so dense that I wasn't able to read them or decipher them. So I made a distinct effort to pull everything out and kind of create it on its own single, simple sheets of paper, and then see how narratives developed within that. And then I've kind of brought those back together into single forms. So I like the note of improvisation, and I like the suggestion towards sublime because it is attempting towards that. The better ones get towards that. The worse ones fall flat, like lots of stuff. Thanks for that.
Of course.
Jill asked Nathan Huff, what type of paper are you using for your work?
I get these rolls of 140 pounds hot press watercolor paper from Dick Blick. And they're 55 inches wide by 30 feet long. They're about $150 per roll. And you can just roll them out and go to town. They take a beating, so I use most gouache and acrylic on them, and you can really dig into them. So that's what I like to use.
Nathan Huff, we happen to know that you were on sabbatical last year in beautiful, amazing places in Europe. And so I just wondered if you could share a little bit about, what kind of maybe inspirations you stumbled upon while you were out there.
Sure. I was able to go on sabbatical from Westmont College and was able to take a full year. And my family and I spent the first couple of months in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. We did a home exchange with an artist family there, which was wonderful. But along the lines of what Nathan was sharing about before, for me, finding artistic mentors in history and kind of following in their footsteps has been a really useful and fruitful thing. So Cézanne's landscapes, particularly his representations of pine trees in watercolor, just get my heart. They just twist me up. So I went to go study the landscape, to look at his paintings, and to try and make some of my own. So that was a really rich and fruitful time. The paintings that I made, I'm not as delighted with, but I think that the time spent studying Cézanne's work again and trying to digest his visuals and along of similar pathways for Van Gogh and some work in Italy was really fruitful. So we'll see how that comes out later.
Great. Any other questions?
Tom has another question for Nathan Huff. He's asking, he assumes, do you work flat on the floor? How are you working on these large pieces of paper?
Most of the time I work on the wall. So here's my studio space right here. You can see there's kind of a large painting up on the wall. Here's the other one that I showed. I tack them up on the wall and then I work directly on there. For really loose gestural watercolors, I will lay it on the ground so that it doesn't slide too much, but I've enjoyed using gouache, which has a little bit less liquid quality to it, and so it doesn't drip down the paper as a kind of technical process. I have a question for you, Nathan, about collecting Nocturne paintings. What are some of the things that people talk about when they purchase a Nocturne painting? What are the things that drive them towards that?
That's a really interesting question. I think particularly with the stuff that we sell from Lockwood Deforest to Leon Dabo, there's a really personal connection. As I sort of alluded to, a lot of what like tonalist painting and the sort of soft focused nocturnes are really about letting the individual viewer bring with them what they can to the space and not having the artist sort of dictate specifically what you're supposed to focus on or see or feel from the experience. I often say here, and many of you probably heard me say this if you've been here, that tonalist paintings, and you could say this about nocturnal landscapes generally, just because of the nature of that you see less in the dark, are often like poems as opposed to more sort of realistic or objective paintings, or like short stories. When you paint a painting like the one behind me, the soft focus and the suggestion of objects and shapes are like a poem, and the artist intentionally sort of restricts themselves to work within certain parameters and make suggestions of much bigger things as opposed to descriptions of specific things, right? And so I think when collectors come in here and they really connect with the nighttime painting, it's the feeling that the painting gives them that they connect to. And it's a very sort of unique and personal connection. And that makes it very special. It's one of the things when young collectors come in here, I try to get them to latch on to the idea that if you put a real unique painting in your home, you get to have the experience of living with that object for as long as you choose to do so. Nobody else gets to have that experience except you and the people in your home. And that's a really special relationship to have with these objects, because whether it's 100 years old or whether it's a painting that you do, these are sort of future artifacts, right? They're going to outlive us and everyone we know, and we'll be a sort of small portion of their history in the grand scheme of things. But in the time that we have them, we have this very personal and intense relationship with them that no one else gets to share. And that's really special. And when you get a painting like that into your home, I hope that will inspire you to sort of, buy more art and put more original stuff in your house. Sort of long-winded answer to your question.
Speaking of collecting, I'm curious, Nathan Vonk, when especially the 19th century Nocturne artists were painting, how were they received at the time, thinking just how critics were so influential back then, and also how with Victorian ideas of color and symbol, like did they see these as really dark and ugly, or would collectors hang a Nocturne in their home by certain artists?
The answer is kind of yes to all of that. Some people really liked them, and there was a sort of, they liked the romantic quality of them. But again, like Whistler sued John Ruskin, the most famous English critic at the time, for libel, and they like fought it out, and both sort of died worse off for having fought it out so violently. And so it wasn't always taken well, because partially it was a movement away from anything that people were familiar with. It was certainly, particularly what Whistler was doing, was sort of very avant-garde, and he was trying new things. And some people responded to it well. But others, particularly the very abstract stuff, one can imagine if you were seeing that sort of rocket painting for the very first time, and you were used to, say, Hudson River School paintings or something that were very realistic, or a French Barbizon painting even, that would have been quite a shock, and it wouldn't have been for everybody. But so that's why I wanted to make that connection to the abstract, because in some ways nocturne paintings by nature have always been at the forefront of the avant-garde of their time, simply because they're difficult to paint and difficult to look at, but also because the nature of dark paintings means that they really are about as much what you can't see or what you're not seeing as what you are seeing.
Well, are there any other burning questions? This is it. We're at an hour, so I can't really see raised hands the way my screen's set up. So I want to say thank you both so much, both for today and all the wonderful insights and information that you shared, but also because of the exhibition and the important different perspectives that each of you brought to it, that we had that art historical perspective on the Nocturne paintings, but then we have Nathan Huff, your work, which I thought was like poetry, which is also why we included poetry in the show, because the night skies invoke such magical things in us, sometimes dark things, sometimes happy, magical, surreal things, but they really do something to us that's actually hard for me to even kind of fully express verbally. But you guys helped nail it in the show, and I think really brought that to the visitors that were able to come and see it in these COVID times. So I'm just really, really grateful to both of you again for today and for everything you brought to the show.
My pleasure.
Indeed. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely.
I wanted to add one more note that we did put photos of all the work that was in our Starry Nights show online, so you can explore Sullivan Goss's work and Nathan Huff's work, and also see that video that Nathan shared. It's on our YouTube page, but also on our exhibition page itself. I shared it in the chat a little earlier, and I can also email you directly if anyone wants to see more.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for all your time, and everybody else for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
Super job.
All right.
Enjoyed it.
Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.